Welcome to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt. Our host, Kenyatta Uzzell, founder and CEO of Polyhire, talks with business leaders about what has elevated their careers. Polyhire has a long-standing track record of successfully recruiting top professionals to enhance the quality of life for all citizens, constituents, and customers. Kenyatta's Talent Hunt does a deep dive into how candidates reach the top of the selection process, examining everything from their education and backgrounds to their work experience and personal style. Kenyatta's guests share key and compelling aspects of their career climbs and give listeners an intimate peek behind the curtain of what it takes to create a leader. Kenyatta's Talent Hunt starts now.
Hello, and welcome to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt. I'm Kenyatta Uzzell, founder of Polyhire and your host. Like many in the country right now, I'm curious and concerned about the state of law enforcement. On our show today, we have one of the nation's leading law enforcement experts. Renee Hall grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where she began her career in law enforcement to ascend to become the first female chief ever to lead the Dallas Police Department. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. Renee, let's start at the beginning. I've got tons of questions for you, and I believe the best place to start is at the beginning. Growing up in Detroit, did you always want to be a police officer, rise to be a police chief?
Oh, gosh, Kenyatta, absolutely not. If you let me tell my story, I was supposed to be a Supreme Court justice. And I say right now, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has my job because that was the job I was supposed to have in my mind. So no, I've always wanted to be a lawyer, but you know, my grandmother used to say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your story. So as I would have it, I went away to Grambling State University, always was going to major in criminal justice because of my desire to be an attorney. Ended up back in the city of Detroit at the University of Detroit Mercy. And one of my professors was the chief of police. And as it would have it, I mean, I didn't pick his class. You know, he wasn't even listed. You know, so I didn't pick his class because he was the chief. He ended up being one of the professors that was to be determined. And as God would have it, we met. We had a lot of back and forth banter about, you know, law enforcement, community, what that meant. He had no idea what my story was because my father was killed in the line of duty in the Detroit Police Department in 1971. I was 6 months old. I had a brother that was 2 and a sister that was 3. And the chief at the time didn't know my story, Benny Napoleon. He became a mentor of mine, talked me into joining the police department, and the rest is history.
Well, he obviously planted a seed that took root and grew a tremendous, remarkable career. What was it like?
I'm thankful.
Yeah,
I'm thankful for that seed, Kenyatta. What he saw in me, I did not see in myself. He told me, in 7 years, you'd be a lieutenant and you're going to be a police chief. And he said this sitting in his classroom, and I had not joined the police department at that time. But I'm excited joining. Take you back to 1998, 99. I'm joining the police department. Everything I touch is absolutely successful. I had never held a gun before in my life. The first time I shot expert. You know, just academically, everything came together. You know, from the time I came out of the academy to taking the first exam for sergeant and lieutenant, I scored in the top bands every single time. I mean, at the top of the list, you know, at one point. And so it was just divine is how I can.
That. Just to have that level of success coming into a profession that you apparently had no interest in, wasn't on your radar. To have that level of success, you said divine. What else is there? There's something about you. There's something that had you excel.
So I believe that, you know, even though law enforcement wasn't my first love, it was my passion. My passion was people. My passion was taking care of those who couldn't, under normal circumstances, take care of themselves, because that's what you do. Even as an attorney, you're providing a level of assistance to individuals who need help in one sense or another. And I think it was that passion and that drive is what helped me to excel. And although in my mind, I saw attorney, God said, I have something else for you to do. And in the police department, I was able to do that as a police officer, creating opportunities for mentorship between law enforcement and, kids in the community, and just continuing that process, whether it was being a mentor to individuals on the police department, men and women underneath me. But it felt like it was what I was supposed to be doing, even though it wasn't what I truly wanted to do initially.
Great. Well, entering into law enforcement, it just to me would seem it would not be, because I don't think it is now, easy task, an easy role for a woman to enter. Did you have obstacles, or talk a little bit about what your experience as a woman was on the police force?
Law enforcement is not an easy profession for men or women. It's an imperfect profession with imperfect people attempting to solve the world's problem. But I will say, as a woman, and as a Black woman specifically, when you look at law enforcement, there's 18,000 police departments in this country. There are more than 800,000 members in law enforcement. Of that, 88% of them are male, and nearly 70% of them are white male. So when you're coming through these police departments as a woman, and as a Black woman specifically, because that's what I can speak to you about, it is challenging. You're always second guessed because you're not supposed to be there. This profession wasn't designed for us. If you're not familiar with the history of women, we weren't even allowed on the police department. And when they allowed us early on in the 40s and 50s, it was more about, coming on in a skirt and working in what they felt was women-oriented professions, dealing with the youth and families and things like that. And women had to sue in the 70s. I think 1977 is when we were, given the full right to be in the space. So imagine being in a space where it's predominantly male, it's predominantly white male, and you're coming in excelling beyond and above most men in the profession. Because let's be honest, there's very few men who make it to be a police chief or a deputy chief or a commander. So as a woman, and as a Black woman excelling, it is challenging. You have people attempting to, cut you off the knees at every level, second guessing everything that you do. Are you qualified? There are two things that you never hear in law enforcement when it comes to men leading, and that is incompetent or in over their head. And when a woman is in these spaces and rising through the ranks, you hear that often, is that individual, she's in over her head, or she's incompetent in this space. Because let's face it, very few men rise to the ranks of the position of chief or deputy chief or commander. So as a woman, and as a Black woman coming through, it is challenging in my opinion, for them to watch you excel above. And society as a whole, when we look at what women have had to fight for rights in all spaces, it becomes very challenging, because when they look at us, they feel that we're not supposed to be there, or we're in a space that is not made for women.
Sure. Well, you obviously did something right, that hard work, and folks thought you were competent because you moved from Detroit to Dallas. And I believe you left Detroit as a deputy chief there, and were recruited to be the leader of the 9th largest city police force, Dallas. Talk a little bit about that transition from Detroit to Dallas.
So, you know what? It was an honor. I would like to say that it wasn't easy. I competed against some of the most prominent police chiefs across the country right now. We were all in either assistant chiefs or deputy chief positions. And the process was very daunting. You arrive in Dallas and you have 7 different panels of members of a nearly 1.4 million people city who are looking at you and asking you questions about how you're going to change their police department. And let's be clear, that was what I was brought in to do. They were looking for a change agent. And having my experience in the city of Detroit, we had gone through a pension crisis, morale, high crime, and having been successful in those spaces, they were looking for someone who could come in and do those same things in Dallas, as well as individuals who had the opportunity or the experience to change culture and bring police departments to the 21st century and implement best practices. And so being selected for that was definitely an honor. and a privilege, and I felt blessed. When I arrived, it was much different than the city of Detroit. As you know, Detroit was an 80% or more Black American city, and very little, racism that I ever experienced or sexism. When I arrived in the city of Dallas, it's a very segregated city. White Americans predominantly live north, Blacks live south of I-30, and Hispanics live east and west. And there's not a lot of, intermingling or co-mingling where individuals live. And so that was different for me. And, then there were other dynamics of just the history of Texas within itself, with race, with sexism, and I experienced it all. And it was very different for me. I knew that I was going into Texas, but I don't know that I knew that in 2017, we were still dealing with some of the same issues that this country had seen in past years. And so a great police department, but I would be lying if I did not tell you that every day I was reminded that I was Black, and I was reminded that I was a woman, and reminded that that wasn't the place that I should be, as a woman and as a Black woman.
Absolutely. And that I know is a challenge. What I want to do right now, because you've had tremendous success, as we all know, but going back, you mentioned the tragedy with your father. How did your family take you saying you wanted to enter law enforcement?
It's a funny story. I came home one day and, had the conversation. And just to give you a little bit of the history, my father's murder is the only police murder in the city of Detroit's history, Detroit's police department's history, that is unsolved.
Wow.
And so I grew up, my family, we grew not ever knowing what happened. We know the story. We know what the police department told us, but we really don't know what happened and who did it. And we understood that obviously there is a very great divide between police and community if no one saw anything. We just don't believe that no one saw anything or no one knows anything. And so, growing up with that, there's a certain stigma on the profession and the mystery and the mystique, or, what lies beneath that, what else is happening. So coming home and having that conversation with my mom was very interesting, because she always pushed us to be the best of who we were. And she never chose for us. She allowed us to choose the career paths that we wanted. And she told me, she said, I would never stop you from doing what it is that you want to do. But I will tell you, I will always be afraid for the phone to ring whenever you're working. And so that was interesting for me. And I didn't know how to process that at the time. So what I made sure that I did every single day is I called her all day, even while I was working, just to let her know I was safe before work, after work, during work, just making sure that she heard my voice and that she knew that I was okay. And that became a ritual, even as a sitting police chief.
Excellent. Excellent. As you move forward in your career, you mentioned community there in the Detroit area. We look at struggles of Detroit, Michigan, or past struggles. Can you discuss your philosophy in helping people build relationships and trust with the police department?
So thank you for that question, because that is so important. We look at where policing started, and policing began on two fronts. On the first one is that, the fire department was kind of, the keepers of the gate. And, when people had a concern, you sent people to help. But then there was another portion of law enforcement that was birthed out of slave patrols. And when you talk about policing and slave patrols, the vision of that is going out and capturing those individuals who had committed some act. In that case, was escaping. And so we have a long history of going out and capturing individuals in our communities. And some of our practices, even today, looks a lot like that. When you see police officers and police departments, when we saturate communities and send out, groups of police officers, and we're investigating and stretching people out and sitting them on the ground and handcuffing them. It is really, it's picturesque for individuals who were able to live through those days. For them to see this, it looks a lot like what their history is. And I think we forget that because we believe that the history was 1800s and this went on until, well into the 1960s. And so our communities are filled with individuals who don't have the best picture or vision or, experience with law enforcement. And so having and building community partnerships was always something that I wanted and it felt like the city needed. And even today, we still see, after 2020 and George Floyd, we still see that there is a breakdown in communication, in relationships. And so, joining the police department, I had an opportunity to create a partnership with Big Brothers, Big Sisters early on in my career as a police officer. Some of my colleagues and I, we recognized that individuals who had parents that had been arrested or incarcerated, we looked at the statistics and saw that the likelihood of those individuals repeating that same cycle was very high. So our thoughts was to go in and build a relationship with those youth, mentor them, coach them, provide them with assistance and some possible direction, if we could, to ensure that they had alternative options and an opportunity to succeed beyond where their parents was. Because oftentimes we experience that the last interaction they had with law enforcement was watching us take away their loved one in some capacity. And so to be able to build that relationship and partnership with Big Brothers, Big Sisters and create that mentorship program allowed us to kind of repair or build some relationships very early on, with youth, because, that is our future. And it is important as to how they see us. We have an opportunity to rebuild relationships with those individuals who are adults in the community. But we had an opportunity to start fresh with some of our youth. And so that was, important to me in Detroit, as well as, even becoming a deputy chief and having the ability and, the autonomy to create a community service program requiring every police officer coming out of the academy to spend 1 week in the community, understanding who our community is. When we think about it, we don't realize that a lot of our police officers don't necessarily come from the communities that they serve. So they really need to understand. The Bible says in all things to get an understanding. And so when you understand who people are, you have an opportunity to provide them what it is that they need. And so them spending 1 week in the community looked like one day at the Capuchin Kitchen. And why is that important? Because individuals eating at the Capuchin Kitchen aren't just individuals who are homeless. It's individuals in our community who have to decide between paying a bill, buying gas, or buying food. So we have a working poor within our community, and our officers needed to understand that how we police them and what we do in our interaction impacts their lives in a number of ways. If we issue them a citation, and sometimes, there's room to issue 7 or 8 citations. How is that going to impact this individual who's already struggling? And this is in no way trying to be soft on crime or soft on our community, but it's creating humanity and empathy in spaces where we have an opportunity to give that and to give grace. And so also they spent time, at a organization for returning citizens, or returning individuals from incarceration to the community. They had an opportunity to sit and listen to their stories, spend the day with them, understanding how when they're out and they're trying to find gainful employment and how difficult that is, that oftentimes they go, 6 months, a year or more attempting to be employed, but not having the opportunity. Why was that important? Because when you come across someone in an investigation and they have a SID number means that they have been incarcerated. That individual is not always up to something or looking to get into something else. They may be just trying to exist and looking for an opportunity to change their lives, and understanding how difficult that is in our community allows them again to just, deploy some level of empathy and provide resources if they have them available. And so it was those kinds of things, spending time with community, with our youth in school, and our senior citizens who, have a wealth of knowledge and would provide it if given the opportunity or you spend time with them. And I know that's a lot that I was talking about, but the reason why I spent time going through that is because that was the important piece that I feel in law enforcement is missing, is that we need to see the individuals in our community as our grandmothers, our sisters, our brothers, that they're members of our family. And how would we want them to be treated if they had an encounter with us, regardless to what the circumstances is, whether it is a homicide scene, a domestic dispute, or just a call for service for some level of assistance. How we interact with them is important. How we treat them is important. And I think that goes a long way to healing some of these broken relationships.
Thank you, Renee. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, more from Renee Hall, leading law enforcement expert and founder of 2 Enterprises.
You are listening to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt, where business leaders share their experiences and lessons learned in their personal and professional journeys. Now back to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt.
Welcome back to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt. I'm Kenyatta Uzzell, and my guest is Renee Hall, a leading voice in law enforcement and police reform. Renee, in recent years, there's been more talk about reform. How do you push those reforms and do your part to avoid tragedies like that of George Floyd?
So, let's talk about George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd was a tragedy. And it did not only impact policing and people in the United States, but it sparked an emotive response across the world. And so that makes it a duty and a responsibility for leaders in law enforcement, commissioners, police chiefs, everyone to ensure that police departments have the kind of 21st century best practices in place, transparency, body-worn cameras, to ensure that we're capturing the interactions of law enforcement, but also accountability, having those measures in place to ensure that you are looking at the behavior of the officers who you employ each and every day, that you're catching their behaviors, or if there is excessive uses of force that exist, that you're not waiting until there's a George Floyd incident to say this officer had 19 separate incidents of use of force. So when you ask, how do you push those reforms? It is incumbent upon the leaders that you select to ensure that those reforms are in place. And it's challenging because when you are looking to change culture, to identify some of those behaviors that exist within law enforcement and make those necessary changes, change is noisy. And it upsets the apple cart and it disrupts the flow of how things work inside of police departments. And you have to have leaders who are strong enough to push through the current. But more than having leaders, it is incumbent upon these mayors, the city managers, these city council people who employ police chiefs to give them the power and the support to do their jobs. Because this is tough work. Reforms, one, are very difficult and they take time. And one of the things that I will say, if we truly wanted reform in this country in law enforcement, it would happen. If we truly, truly wanted it, because it is not difficult. It is not difficult to require police agencies and police departments to put in transparency, accountability measures, and make sure that we're operating with procedures and policies that are the standard across this country. But we don't have that. We haven't had that pushed down from our government level. And so it is incumbent upon every individual to make sure that happens. And because if we don't, we will continue to see the things like 2020 George Floyd. And if we're going to be honest, George Floyd is the one that got captured. We are not oblivious to what happens between law enforcement and community and individuals who have used excessive amounts of force, resulting in death of our community members. And I don't want my words to appear as if I am anti-police, because I believe in police departments. I believe in the work of law enforcement. As I said, I lost a father to this profession. And so it cannot be in vain. What we do is important, but how we do it is even more important. And the impact that we leave in communities is the most important. And I believe that if we're going to ever change it, we have to be allowed to change, but we need that support. Because as I said before, when you're attempting to reform or change the culture of what has existed in police agencies across this country, it is noisy, it is loud, it is media grabbing, and most police chiefs who come in to reform don't last long.
Right. I've seen that as a recruiter. Trust me, I see that. I see that every day. How do we spread this mentality, this philosophy, this culture change around the country?
Well, first, we have to identify that there's a culture change needed. We have fraternal orders of police, unions, associations who refuse to have this conversation. And the other part of that, and let me start by saying this. I respect unions. I grew up in the city of Detroit with a union, and I believe that they exist to ensure that the rights of police officers exist and that they're not taken advantage of. And so I respect the work that they do. But I think the challenge is when you use that platform to support all behavior by police officers, because some behaviors is indefensible. And we attempt in that space where we have associations and unions, and we attempt to defend the indefensible. And that is where our problems start. We have to make sure that we're identifying where there are problems. And there is a culture within policing that allows certain behaviors. And until we identify them and make the necessary steps to ensure that they don't exist, and that is in accountability. Because if you are recording the behaviors of officers whenever they interact with a resident or a community member, when we are monitoring the behavior of law enforcement, we're able to say we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing, and we're monitoring that. When we put in the right policies and procedures and or general orders. And beyond that, I really believe in police oversight. I believe in police oversight because I believe in policing. And I believe if we're telling the communities across this country that we are doing the right things, our police officers are doing what they're supposed to do, then why are we afraid to allow them to come in and see it? Because if they come in and see exactly what we do, then they'll know what we're doing is the right thing. And in those instances, because there are not a lot of instances, but in those instances where we don't get it right, where we fail to do what it is that we're supposed to do, then we correct ourselves, but we also allow the community to say, I'm watching them as they correct the behavior, whether that is discipline and or termination of officers. And I also think that there's a space in there for us to provide grace to officers, because there are mistakes of the mind and there are mistakes of the heart. And every officer doing this job, this is an imperfect profession and we're imperfect people. So we're not going to always get it right. And so when we don't get it right, we have to examine to what degree was this a mistake, a mind of or the heart, and then give grace to the mistake of the mind. And say that this was accidental, and we need to allow police departments to discipline to the point of this was a mistake of the mind, and then that mistake of the heart, where you intentionally did something that violated the trust of the community, the policies of the police department, to discipline to that level as well. And I think the community has a difficult time with grace is because we defend everything instead of creating an opportunity to defend only those things where we look at is that this is an imperfect situation and they did not make the right choice. But when we try to defend the indefensible, that is when our community is not really open for grace.
Well, you're absolutely involved in organizations that are at the forefront of these discussions and conversations and changing that culture. One, you're an elected officer within Noble. Can you talk a little bit about what Noble does and your involvement with that organization?
So the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives is an organization that was established in 1976. And we exist because, as I talked about early on, there were very few Black Americans in law enforcement. There were very few women in law enforcement. And we existed to ensure that individuals who look like us had an opportunity to, one, be a part of law enforcement agencies, be a part of the rank and file, and then ascend to the ranks of police chief and just have the opportunity. We serve as the conscience of law enforcement to make sure that we are behaving in law enforcement in a manner that is conducive to the communities that we serve. One of the things that I will say over and over again, police departments across this country, we police and patrol Black communities. We exist for white communities. I'll say this, and it's probably controversial, but when do you go into white communities and see a white kid stretched across the concrete, sitting on the concrete, stretched across police cars, pat down, and handcuffed sitting on the concrete? You don't see it. But what we see is in communities of color that this exists. And I am not oblivious to the levels of crime that exist in Black communities, but I do believe that there's dignity in policing and that we have to make sure that even though we're policing communities that have existing, high numbers of violent crime, that we are doing so with the dignity and the respect that they deserve, because everyone does. And so that's why Noble exists. We exist to ensure policy and procedure. We work alongside of Department of Justice and the White House to ensure that policing across this country is equitable. And so my role currently as the national second vice president, which I will ascend to the presidency in 2 years, is to work within that organization with our committees. We have a number of committees that work to further the cause of law enforcement, to build a community, to work alongside of U.S. Conference of Mayors, public administrators, just to make sure that we are creating the kind of policing across this country that the communities want to see, both Black and white communities want to see, and that communities can be proud of.
Great. You're known as the praying police chief.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So that is what I was nicknamed. I heard that they called me when I went to Dallas. And let me say, Dallas is an amazing city. It has had its share of triumph and as well as tragedy. But when I arrived a year after 2016 7/7. Where 5 police officers were gunned down after a Black Lives Matter rally. This individual was a lone individual who really was angry about what had happened in 2014 and 2015, Michael Brown, Eric Garner. We could go on, and decided that he was going to take that out on law enforcement on that day. And so 4 Dallas police officers, as well as 1 DART officer, was murdered by this individual. And so when I arrived in Dallas, we were still healing from that. There was a lot of broken relationships in the community. There was a lot of blame, on both parts. There was the police department faulted a group of Black organizations who, were marching on that day. And, the individuals in the community blamed the police because they felt like if police response and activity had not been what it was, not only in other cities, but in Dallas in their history as well, that there would have been no need to have this march. And so I watched police officers who had not really dealt with what had happened in the community and in the police department. They were existing. They were continuing to do the work, but they were hurting. And so I am a praying person. I am a very spiritual person. I believe in God. And I felt that my police department needed prayer. We needed the ability to heal. We needed an avenue. And so a lot of times, I started my command staff meetings, not forcing any prayer upon anybody, but I've started them praying. very early on in my tenure, we had 2 police officers who were shot and one was killed, Officer Santander. And at that time, they were working, got a call to the Home Depot, and an individual ended up shooting both of them. We were at the hospital. I was providing updates to the officers. You know, my police department was about 3,100 sworn and about 800, 900 non-sworn. And at any given time in the cafeteria waiting area, there was hundreds of police officers waiting to hear what was happening. And, you know, when I went in to give them the first update, one of my statements is, at this time, we need to be praying. And I offered prayer and they all bowed their heads. And, you know, every hour when I went in to update, you know, I gave them, you know, his condition and where he was. And then I would hear officers say, "Chief, can you pray?" And so that was something that I always did, you know, and praying is not unfamiliar to law enforcement. We do it, but we do it ceremonially. For me, I did it on a regular basis because I believe it's what we needed. And not only did we need prayer, we needed additional resources for officers who needed to heal. And that was bringing in additional clinical psychologists, making sure that we extended our peers program and created opportunities for them to reach out to assistance and virtually, and maintaining their anonymity, because that's what we needed. And it was at that time that I heard that my nickname was the praying police chief, you know, and some people liked it and some people didn't. But, you know, I believe that when you choose individuals and we say we want diverse police departments, then you have to take the person in who they are totally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. That may look different than it used to, but you had the first Black woman police chief who was praying, and that was who I was. And I think that's who they brought in. And I'm proud of that.
Praying chief. I like that. There are folks that are listening to you right now who are thinking about entering into law enforcement, hoping to become leaders within law enforcement, to ascend to the rank of chief, deputy chief, many of those command positions, and those that are looking to grow in their professions. What would you say to a cadet or someone who's currently thinking about a position within law enforcement when we see the divisiveness that's taking place in the country, where if you're on the right, the police can do no wrong. If you're on the other side, everything the police does is wrong. What advice and guidance would you give someone who's thinking about this career, knowing that they may not have the support that police 20 years ago had in communities?
So what I will tell anyone who's looking to come into law enforcement is we need you. We need you in this space, and we need you to come in with the mindset of community. I mean, if you're looking to do this job, no one comes into policing to be rich, because it's just not going to happen. So you come in with a desire to make a difference in some kind of way, to help those who can't, under normal circumstances, help themselves. And I will tell them that we need you, but we need you to come in and look at law enforcement for what it is today. It looks different than it did years ago. When you walk into police departments today, we want you to come in with the mindset of helping others. And that looks different than it did years ago. We need to understand that, you know, if you have to love and respect everyone. This community looks a lot different than it did when I joined. When I joined the police department, we didn't have LGBTQIA. We didn't have bathrooms that were unisex. I mean, we have people in our communities that we had never experienced before. And I think that we have to have individuals who are open and who are willing to respect, to honor, to love, and to support those individuals in that space. We have a job to do. There is crime in our cities, in our country, and we need individuals who are willing to go after individuals who are committing that crime. But we also need you to know that everyone is not a criminal. We do have a lot of crime in our Black communities, but every Black person is not a criminal. So we need you, but we need you to come in and we need to teach differently within our police department. I would say not only to the individual that I'm inviting and encouraging to join, but I would also reach out and say in law enforcement agencies, the way we train is different today. We have always trained, and I was trained, that you're going home by any means necessary. That means you'll do whatever it takes, but you're going home. Our training needs to be, after this encounter, we're both going home by any means necessary, because that changes how we interact. It changes that it's all about me to it's all about us. And so I believe that there are a lot of shifts that have to happen in law enforcement today. As we speak about the right versus left, I believe that politicians need to step back, because law enforcement can't be politicized. We're apolitical. We can't determine when we go to a call for service. We don't get to ask, well, are you Democratic or are you Republican? We don't get to ask those questions. So there's no room in law enforcement for politics. Again, when we talk about, if you're on the right, you can do no wrong. If you're on the left, nothing you do is right. We have to look at law enforcement for what it is. And we have to say that there are challenges in law enforcement, and we need to select leaders who are strong enough, who are willing to make those necessary changes. But beyond just the chief, we need to start selecting mayors, city managers, and city council people who don't have political agendas, who are also empathetic to the community itself, and say, we're going to support those leaders who want to make sure that there is equitable treatment in everyone. And we erase a Democrat or Republican or independent or whatever it is, because there's no place for it.
You are a CEO. You're a CEO of one of the largest police departments. You're a CEO of your own organization right now. What tips would you give those that are looking to join or hoping to join a business or an organization?
First of all, do your research. Find out what organization that you are joining. What is the culture? What are the policies? What are the procedures? The culture of that organization is important, because you need to find out if you're the right fit. So I think that's most important. And also, as an individual looking to join any organization, when you're talking about whether you're the right fit, who's leading this organization? What do you want to gain while you're in the organization, and what do you want to do? What are your goals? You also want to ask these corporations, what are they looking for in an employee? What does a successful employee actually look like? Because what we assume and what is actually the expectation can often be different. When you're going into an organization or a corporation, there's a lot that's entailed in that. What city is it in? What is the history of the city? What is the culture of that actual city? And how does that show up in the organization that you're joining? So I think that the important thing is to know the organization that you're joining, but your skill level, are you prepared? What skills do you need to be successful in that space? Do you have them? I've found that oftentimes there are individuals who will show up and not necessarily have the skill set, and they get the job, but they don't necessarily have what it takes to be successful in that space. So make sure that you have all of the skills, the knowledge, and the ability to actually do the job, because sometimes we get a little cocky in our space. I can do that. I've seen someone else do that, but you need to make sure that you have all the training that's necessary for that particular position.
And on the other side of that question, as an employer, what are employers looking for in a candidate?
We're looking for those competencies that I just talked about, the knowledge, skills, and abilities. We're looking to see if people are willing to do their homework. Do they know anything about the organization? But more than that, attitude, how you show up. Are you open to new ideas? What are you bringing to the organization for change? Because oftentimes, as a CEO, we're doing certain things, but what can we be doing different? Do you have the capacity to think outside the box? And are you open to even introduce change? Are you strong? Your strength. Some of these corporations and organizations, they eat their own. Do you have the strength and the emotional intelligence to be able to operate within that space? So all of those things are important.
My next to last question, Renee, this is one that I plan on asking everyone. I started to believe in my last podcast, but what keeps you up at night?
Right now, the election, this 2024 election. And I say that because who wins this election is going to impact law enforcement tremendously. And whether I'm a sitting police chief, whether I'm a civilian or running my own corporation, how law enforcement interacts in these communities is so very important. That role is important to me. And I think that this election is going to determine what the state of our democracy and our country is going to look like. And that keeps me up at night because I believe that if we have any chance of reform, there's one individual that cannot be elected.
And on that note, I say finally, there was one more question. Are there any parting words or messages that you have for our listeners?
For those who are listening, I'm not sure who's listening, whether you're a CEO looking to be a CEO, you're in law enforcement looking to be in law enforcement, former law enforcement. I will tell you that leading is extremely challenging. And the leader in 2024 has to be a different kind of leader than previous years. What we have is a duty and a responsibility to community, to safety, to law enforcement, to whatever organization that you have. You have a duty and a responsibility for transparency, for people to know what is happening within your organization. You have a duty and a responsibility for accountability for people who are operating in your organization. And you have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that whatever is happening in that organization that does not meet the needs of the communities that we serve, that we change that behavior. One of the things that I do want to say about law enforcement specifically, we try over the years to determine whether a chief or a commissioner is good by, how many homicides they solve. Homicides is what every chief their success is determined by, but it's the one crime that they have no control over. And I would just say that because you are able to reduce homicides by 2 more than your previous individual, or they go up 2 more than the previous individual who were sitting in the seat, does not determine your ability to do the job. What determines your ability to do the job is how you treat the individuals who work under you, how you govern the communities that you serve and sign up to protect, and also your commitment to making sure that all of law enforcement, because what happens in one city affects the world as we know it. But you're responsible for making sure that how you show up represents the integrity and duty of every law enforcement officer across this country. I just want everyone to know that I am proud to be a former law enforcement professional. I love law enforcement. I'm going to always work to ensure that we as a body, a community, a country get the best from law enforcement, out of law enforcement, and as a community that we work with law enforcement. So I just want to take my hat off to everyone who continues to do the job every day. It is tough, but it is not impossible. And so just want to thank everybody for what they do each and every day and wish them the best and pray for their continued success.
Renee Hall, thank you for spending time with me today. Thank you for your service. And I'd also like to thank our listeners, each and every one of you, for joining us today. You can follow Kenyatta's Talent Hunt on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
You've been listening to Kenyatta's Talent Hunt with our host, Kenyatta Uzzell, founder and CEO of Polyhire. We'll see you next time on Kenyatta's Talent Hunt.